Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most aggressive and fascinating moves in the entire corporate playbook. How you can buy a whole company even when its own leaders are absolutely dead set against selling. So let's just kick things off with a scenario that gets right to the heart of corporate power struggles. Imagine this. You've got your eye on a company, you want to own it, but its board of directors and its CEO, they won't even take your call. So how on earth do you get the deal done? Well, the answer is a really clever and pretty audacious move called a tender offer. You see, it's a way to completely bypass the boardroom. Instead of wasting time negotiating with executives who've already said no, you go straight to the company's real owners, the shareholders, with a public offer to buy their stock. And usually, you make it a very, very attractive price. And by going straight to the shareholders, you completely change the dynamic of the whole thing. What was supposed to be a private negotiation happening behind closed doors, well, it suddenly becomes this public battle for control, fought right out there in the open market for everyone to see. Now, to really understand the tender offer, we've got to travel back in time to its most, let's be honest, cinematic chapter, the 1980s. This was the decade of the so-called corporate raiders, a time when the tender offer became a weapon that struck fear into boardrooms all across America. Look, corporate mergers have been happening in waves for over a century, but the wave in the 1980s, it was just different. This wasn't about friendly companies combining forces. No. It was defined by a surge of aggressive, hostile bids, earning it the name the takeover era. This era was dominated by these larger-than-life figures known as corporate raiders, guys like Carl Icahn and T. Boone Pickens. And their toolkit, it was simple but devastatingly effective. You launch a hostile cash tender offer, you finance it with this high-yield, high-risk debt that became known as junk bonds, and then you target these massive, underperforming companies that you see as bloated and just plain inefficient. And this quote, it just perfectly captures the vibe of the time. The slang they used for a surprise bid, a Saturday night special, sounds like something straight out of a gangster film, right? It was all about speed and shock, trying to ram a deal through before the target company could even figure out what hit them. So, with these raiders launching surprise attacks left and right, target companies couldn't just sit back and take it. They had to fight back, and this led to an incredible arms race of corporate offense and defense, with all sorts of new tactics popping up on both sides of the battlefield. And pretty soon, it became this high-stakes strategic chess match. The bidder's main weapon was always the offer premium, basically offering a price so high that shareholders just couldn't say no. But the target's ultimate defense was something called the poison pill. You can think of it like a defensive self-destruct button, that if a hostile bidder tries to take over, suddenly makes the company way, way more expensive to buy. So that premium we talked about, it's everything. To get shareholders to sell their stock, bidders had to make a really compelling offer. A typical premium was around 30% above the stock's current price, but in the heat of a really nasty hostile battle, that could easily jump to 50%, sometimes even higher. Now, besides the poison pill, boards had other tricks up their sleeve. They could try to find a friendlier buyer, known as a white knight, or maybe try to tie the bidder up in court for years. And this is where you see this huge philosophical split. In the US, a board can use all these tactics, but in the UK and in Europe, a board is pretty much forbidden from blocking a bid without getting shareholder approval first. The power to decide rests almost entirely with the shareholders themselves. Okay, so after the wild ride of the 1980s, things did calm down a bit, but the tender offer didn't just disappear. Nope, it evolved. The once notorious hostile tool has now become a totally routine and often friendly part of the global finance playbook. Kind of funny, but today, tender offers are most often used in friendly deals. It's a process called a two-step merger. First, you do a tender offer to quickly grab a majority of the shares, and that's followed by a simple merger to get the rest. And why do they do it? Simple. It is way, way faster than waiting months and months for a traditional shareholder vote. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because the rules for this stuff are completely different all over the world. In the United States, you can buy up almost all of a company's stock without ever having to make a formal offer to everybody. But in Europe, India, and Japan, the law is the exact opposite. Once you cross a certain ownership line, usually around 30%, you are legally required to make a fair offer to every single shareholder who's left. And there's one last critical move in this global playbook. It's called the squeeze out. Once a bidder gets a huge majority of shareholders to agree, we're talking 90 or 95%, the law lets them just force the remaining holdouts to sell their shares at the exact same price. It's the final checkmate to get to 100% ownership. Okay, so all of this high finance corporate maneuvering, why should you, the average investor, actually care about any of this? Well, if you happen to own stock in a company that suddenly becomes a target, believe me, it matters a great deal. The data is pretty darn clear on this. For shareholders of a company being bought, tender offers have historically delivered bigger returns. Academic studies show average gains of around 30% in tender offers, and that's compared to about 20% in your standard traditional merger. That is a significant difference. This price premium also creates this fascinating opportunity for professional traders. See, when a deal is announced, the stock price usually jumps up, but it almost never goes all the way to the full offer price. That tiny little gap between the current price and the final price, that's called the spread. And a whole industry of traders, called merger arbitrageurs, exists just to buy that stock and profit from that small spread when the deal finally closes. But this is a super risky game with some really sharp legal edges. A famous case involved the hedge fund manager Bill Ackman. He secretly bought a massive stake in a company called Allergen because he knew his partner was about to launch a tender offer. A court later decided there was a pretty plausible case that this was illegal insider trading, using secret knowledge for personal gain. And all of this leaves us with a final, really big question to think about. The very existence of the tender offer is a powerful reminder that in the world of public companies, the ultimate authority doesn't always lie with the executives in the corner office. Sometimes real power lies with the millions of individual shareholders who, when they act together, can decide a company's entire fate.